The morning light slanted across Willow Creek as Thomas Hayes rattled down Main Street on the old tractor. The machine breathed in coughing fits, a metallic wheeze that bounced off shop windows and the red brick walls of the courthouse. Kids paused their paper cups of lemonade, eyes widening at the sight, then smirked and nudged each other. Teenagers lounging by the feed store cupped their hands and called out, "Need a push, Tom?" Laughter spilled into the road like gravel. Thomas kept his eyes on the lane between the chalk parking lines, on that thin stripe of quiet nobody else seemed to notice. The steering wheel vibrated under his palms, a familiar tremor that traveled up his arms and anchored him. He knew the sound people heard, the clatter, the rattle, the shameless honesty of age. But there was another sound under it, the rhythm his father taught him to hear. 3 knocks, a catch, then the piston finding home. Proof the old heart still beat. He passed the diner where men in caps lifted their coffee mugs as if in salute, but their smiles bent the wrong way. 2 women on the sidewalk gave that tight little smirk, polite enough to pass for kindness if you squinted. The headlight on the right bobbed, cracked lens flashing like a tired eyelid. The paint was the color of dried blood in places, bare iron in others, a memoir written in dents. Thomas adjusted the choke of hair. The engine cleared its throat. "That's it," he murmured, not to the town but to the tractor. The sound steadied. Only then did he allow himself to glance sideways at the window glass and catch his reflection. Sweat at his temples, jaw set. He didn't look beaten. He looked awake. By the time he reached the end of Main, the laughter had thinned, not vanished, just moved behind him like dust. He turned toward the county road that led to the competition fields. The tires hummed over the tar seams. One last shout chased him. "Scrapyard's the other way." He raised a hand, not an apology but acknowledgement, and kept going. The old machine answered with a low, sure growl, as if promising it would carry him the rest of the way. The road unspooled past wind-gnarled oaks and square-shouldered barns. Out here, away from storefront eyes, the air smelled like sun-warmed hay. Thomas's grip eased and the world rearranged into things that made sense. Fences that needed mending, a gate hinge that squealed, the hedgerow where quail liked to startle your heart out of your chest. His grandfather had carved this place out with the slow courage of a man who never expected applause. His father had added a second barn in a year of fat harvest, built the corn dryer from parts nobody else wanted, and bought this very tractor as a promise. They would keep up in their way, at their pace. Thomas grew up in the lullaby of its engine, small hands on the fender, while his father drove straights, so true you could measure your life against them. Then came the lean years. The rain missed, and when it came arrived fierce and late, churning topsoil into chocolate soup. Bank managers stopped using first names. The price of seed rose even as the worth of grain fell. A seesaw that threw your stomach in the air and left it there. Thomas ran numbers at the kitchen table until they were just shapes. To keep the lights on, he sold the side pasture. To meet the note, he sold 2 head of cattle and a shotgun he hadn't fired in years. What he didn't sell was a tractor. He learned every bolt, like you learn the scars on your own hands. At night he'd lie on the cold concrete with his shop light at his shoulder, the green spine manual open, and fix what he could and modify what he couldn't. His father's pencil sketches, dog-eared and greasy, were still tacked above the workbench, diagrams of wild ideas he never had the money to finish. When word of the regional harvest contest spread, state-sponsored, cash prize that could clear a year's debt, a supply contract that could outlast the storms. Thomas circled the date and didn't tell a soul. The fine print said any machine that could harvest within the window qualified. It said nothing about paint or pedigree. He registered in person, signed his name with a hand that shook and steadied. He parked at the last rise before the fields and killed the engine. Silence dropped into the cab, loud as a bell. He rested his forehead against the wheel, just long enough to hear the echo of his father's voice. Not wisdom, exactly, just cadence. A man doesn't quit because people laugh. He quits when he forgets why he's fighting. Thomas lifted his head. The why was all around him. The fence lines, the stubble, the house you could barely see from here, but felt like gravity. He started the tractor again and drove toward the sound of crowds. The valley had been trimmed into spectacle. Fences ribboned with county flags. Loudspeakers stuttering, warming the crowd. Vendors handed over paper baskets of fried, dough dusted white as first frost. The sun made mirrors out of new paint, row after row of tractors lined like phalanxes. You could smell money in the polish. Thomas rolled in late enough that people turned to the noise as if a helicopter were landing. The old engine's cough felt naked against the purr of air-conditioned cabs and the soft whine of computer guts. Conversations paused. Heads tipped. The sound registered. Laughter followed, automatic as a switch. He found his assigned lane and took his place at the tail of the line of machines that looked bred rather than built. Beside him, a teenager in a company shirt openly filmed him on a phone, mouthing something to friends. A woman in a straw hat shook her head, pity furrowing her brow like a plow. The convoy arrived, glossy hoods throwing knives of light, tires so deep-treaded they seemed anxious to chew the earth. The lead SUV was black and long, the kind that made a statement even when parked. The door opened, and out stepped Richard Callahan. He wore money like other men wore dust. Sunglasses mirrored the crowd back at itself. He scanned the field like a man assessing a chessboard. He intended to win in 6 moves. Thomas felt the weight of his gaze before it landed. The SUV rolled forward until it idled alongside the old tractor. The window slid down. Callahan leaned with perfect casualness, a smile arranged to look careless and landing just this side of cruel. "Hayes," he said, projecting without raising his voice. "I admire your commitment to nostalgia. But this," he flicked 2 fingers toward the tractor, "this is performance art." A ring of laughter answered. Callahan's smile sharpened. "Do yourself a favor. Save your pride. Walk away while you can still pretend you chose to." Thomas let the engine idle until the knock settled into the gentle thud he trusted. He didn't answer the man. He didn't look at the phone train on him or the judge pretending not to listen. He slid the tractor forward to the chalk at the starting line and set the brake with a firm click. The sound seemed to carry farther than it should. The announcer's voice broke back in, strained cheerful, "And we are nearly ready to begin." Callahan's window slid up. The SUV glided off like a shark. A flag snapped in the hot breeze. "On my mark," the marshal called, arm raised. Engines across the field rose in a shared animal growl. Thomas laid his palm on the dash as if blessing it. The marshal's arm dropped. The modern tractors leapt. Their blades kissed the earth and drew stripes straight as ruled lines. In the cabs, operators sat cool as librarians, hands barely moving. From the first row, a cheer went up, cheap and easy, the way crowds always applaud speed. Thomas eased the clutch. The old machine shuddered, coughed, and reached forward like someone standing from a deep chair. The front tires found the furrow. The frame thrummed. He felt the first hiccup before he heard it and corrected with the heel of his hand and a breath. The tiller bit balked, then settled into a chew he knew as well as his own heartbeat. Dust lifted and hung in a curtain. Heat pressed against his shoulders. He drove by touch as much as sight, by the way the wheel tugged, by the strain in the motor when the soil turned stubborn, by the click he'd learned meant a pebble, not a rock. He adjusted the depth by a quarter turn and felt the machine relax like a muscle unclenching. He made the end of the first row as the polished beasts in the adjacent lanes reached their second. The scoreboard flashed numbers and percentages that made people shake their heads. A boy on the fence shouted, "You got this," and looked embarrassed when his friends laughed. Thomas nodded once anyway, unseen. Halfway down the third row, the engine hiccuped again, longer this time. He listened and heard not failure but thirst, the kind that comes from pulling more than the day allows. He throttled back just slightly and angled to avoid a patch where the soil crusted white. The machine smoothed. It wasn't fast. It was something else. Honest, maybe. Unashamed of what it could not do. Certain about what it could. From the shade tent, Callahan watched through dark lenses, arms crossed. Mechanics in matching shirts stood behind him with tool cases like doctors waiting outside an operating theater. "Let him have his mile," Callahan said lightly. "It makes the ending cleaner." The first stall sounded like a cough in a crowded room. Heads turned. One of the new tractors, sleek as a bullet, jolted and then froze mid-row. Its operator frowned into a screen and touched buttons with more urgency. A second cough. 2 lanes over, grew into a clank that made people wince. The announcer kept up a patter that started to wobble. Under the soil of Willow Creek lived stones with opinions. They weren't big as boulders or small as gravel. They were the wrong size, mean fistfuls that lodged just so, sharp edges waiting to test new metal. The rain of a generation had pushed them up like memories no one wanted to talk about. The expensive blades were tuned for speed in clean fields, and here the stones bit back. Machines stopped, their beleaguered operators popping down in crisp shirts to kneel in the dust and work bolts that didn't want to give. Time bled out around them. The crowd noise lifted into surprise, then laughter, then something too interested to be either. Thomas's old tiller was not elegant. It was patient. Its teeth rode over small stone and flexed around the wrong size. Every time it met an obstacle, the tug that came to the wheel traveled straight into the bones of his hands, and he answered without thinking. A feather off the throttle, a nudge on the brake, a little lift on the depth. He had learned this on afternoons when his father was too tired to explain and simply said, "Listen." The rows behind him weren't pretty the way a machine makes pretty. They were clean the way a human hand teaches clean. He reached the end of a pass and spun the old girl with a motion he could do blindfolded. When he looked up at the bleachers, eyes looked back that weren't laughing. A man in a suit had stopped pretending to check his watch. Two girls who had jeered earlier were elbowing each other, whispering with eyes bright. The boy from the fence had edged closer. Dust turned his skin the color of the field. Sweat burned his eyes. He blinked it away and found the line again. With each row, the shock of seeing the old tractor still moving gave way to a different feeling in the crowd. Unexpected loyalty. It is a strange thing to feel ashamed for laughing too quickly. The sound of it is quieter, almost like respect. By noon, the sun felt personal. Thomas rolled the inner row and idled while he took a swallow from a bottle that tasted like the inside of a hose. A shadow crossed the hood. He looked up to see polished leather stepping into the dirt. Callahan, jacket off now, sleeves rolled like a performance of work, stood with his hands on his hips and a smile meant for cameras. "Hayes," he said, voice wider than the space between them. "I'll give you points for persistence, but we both know how this ends. Sell me the land. Today, I'll pay above market and save you this public unraveling." Thomas climbed down deliberately, boots whispering against the step. Standing on the ground, he felt taller than he had in months. The crowd sensed an edge and quieted. The announcer, bless him, "Shut up. This isn't unraveling," Thomas said. "This is remembering." Callahan's eyebrows ticked up behind the dark glass. He lowered his voice as if offering kindness. "Nostalgia won't cover your note. Farmers like you don't need legend. You need solvency." Thomas studied a man's cufflink, bright as a coin. "Maybe, but my father didn't hold this place together with nostalgia. He held it with work, and he left me more than a mortgage." He turned back to the tractor and reached beneath the left side of the frame to a lever that looked like it ought to do nothing. He pulled. The mechanism groaned awake. From under the belly of the machine, a hinged frame unfolded, settling with a final, satisfied clack. It was ugly the way genius sometimes is. Practical angles, hand-cut plate, bolts scavenged from other lives. The small crowd closest to him leaned in, as if watching a magician. "My father drew this on butcher paper the year the creek flooded," Thomas said. "Built it with money we didn't have and time he stole from sleep. It flexes where it needs to. It rides the rocks like a wheel. He never patented it. He just used it." Callahan's smile thinned. "Charming," he said too loudly. "Irrelevant." Thomas climbed back up. He pushed the throttle. The tractor's note changed, less labored, more eager. He dropped the implement, felt it catch, then glide. The next row unspooled smoother than any yet, the stones turning from enemies into nuisances. People who had drifted toward the concession stands drifted back. The judge nearest him leaned into his colleague and whispered behind a clipboard he forgot was useless as a shield. Callahan watched the old machine cut its next pass and did not move aside when the dust reached his shoes. The crowd's attention slipped off him and settled on the simple grace of something working the way it was made to work. Afternoon light laid everything bare. The new machines lined the lanes like sullen racehorses in need of a different track. Mechanics swarmed too with their guts open, wires like veins, a laptop glowing desperate blue. A third sat angled, blade tooth chipped in a way that made its operator stare at his hands as if they had betrayed him. Thomas drove. He did not look at the scoreboard except once, accidentally, and then the numbers were just numbers. He looked instead at the way the turned soil lay, at the small side the earth made when it changed sides, at the birds bold enough to hop after him pecking, at what his passing revealed. Callahan spoke briefly to a judge, then longer, then animatedly. The judge shook his head and, at last, lifted a rule booklet. Any machine that can harvest within the allotted time qualifies. The man said, not loud, but clear enough to be overheard. No minimum model year. No tech requirement. That was your push, if memory serves Mr. Callahan, to keep it open and fair. The billionaire's jaw tightened. He turned away and pulled a checkbook from his breast pocket. He strode to the edge of Thomas's lane and raised his voice. Name your price. Right now. Farm, equipment, mineral rights. I'll write the first zero big enough to make your eyes water. Thomas throttled down and let the old machine idle, then stepped to the ground and walked a fence. Dust had turned the sweat on his face into clay. He rested his hands on the top rail and looked at the man as if he were just a man. The crowd hushed. Not everything has a price, Thomas said. I'm not a fool. I know what a dollar can do, but I also know what it can't. It can't make rain come early. It can't teach a boy how to listen to an engine. It can't give a man back his father. This land isn't for sale. Not to you. Not today. Someone in the bleachers started clapping, and then everybody was. It sounded like weather coming in. Callahan stood very still. Then he put the checkbook away. Thomas finished the last pass with a steadiness that felt like prayer. When the marshal waved him in, he killed the engine and sat while the silence filled up around him. The scoreboard flickered, recalculated, then flashed positions. He was third, and third meant money enough to clear the clawed-back payments and breathing room for a contract that would outlast a season. He climbed down to hands reaching, clapping his shoulder, squeezing his arm, shaking his hand harder than such hands usually did. He looked for the boy from the fence and found him grinning, like this was his victory too. Thomas smiled back, quick and genuine. On the far side of the field, Callahan turned away and walked toward his SUV. Weeks later, the town smelled like cinnamon and diesel. The Harvest Festival took over Main Street. Trucks polished to pride, pies cooling on windowsills that had not seen a fresh coat of paint in a decade, fiddles sawing the same old tunes that refused to die. Sunlight snagged on strings of pennants and on the chrome of 100 careful machines. At noon, the parade lined up. Thomas's tractor waited, washed as clean as it could be washed, and then decorated as if for a wedding. Ribbons trailed from the exhaust. Children had taped paper flowers to the hood with more enthusiasm than skill. Someone had wiped the cracked headlight until it shone like an honest thing. When he climbed aboard, the cheer that rose was deeper than noise. It sounded like relief. He drove across down Main. People he barely knew called his name, as if they could claim a piece of what he'd done. Old-timers took their caps off without realizing it. A woman with flour on her apron wiped her eyes and laughed at herself. He kept one hand on the wheel and let the other fall open at his side in a half-wave, half-blessing. Near the courthouse, reporters waited behind a rope strung at knee-height. Microphones lifted like dandelions ready to blow. He parked and cut the engine. The sudden quiet made the next bird call sound like a bell. A woman in a blazer leaned forward. "How did you do it?" she asked, earnest. "How did that tractor beat the most advanced machines in the field?" Thomas rested his palm on the warm hood, feeling the tick of metal cooling. "It didn't beat them," he said. "It outlasted them. There's a difference. My father used to say a tool is only as strong as the hands and heart that guide it. This machine worked because it was made for this ground, and because I know its voice." The words were simple, but the way he spoke them made pens move faster. He was asked again if he'd sell. He said no without theater. Asked if he felt vindicated. He shrugged and said he felt tired and grateful. Someone handed him a plate of pie and a plastic fork, and he laughed for the first time in a long time in a way that surprised him with its ease. In the weeks that followed, the story ran farther than the county line. A picture of the old tractor with its ribbon exhaust appeared under headlines that used words like grit and heart without irony. Farmers in other towns nodded at the paper and said, "Yes," as if they were agreeing to something more than a story. People with no dirt under their nails clipped the article and stuck it on the fridge to remind themselves of something they needed reminding of. Richard Callahan did not come back to Willow Creek. His company steered the next development toward a county where the soil was tamer and the people less attached to the shape of their history. In Willow Creek, his name became a footnote you needed to remember to explain the good part of the tale. One evening, Thomas parked the tractor by the barn and sat on the step as dusk folded the fields into blues. Crickets started their small orchestra. He could hear, if he listened just right, the aftersound of the engine in the bones of the place. He reached up to nail over the workbench and touched the edge of one of his father's sketches, the paper gone soft with years. He didn't say anything out loud. He didn't need to. The town had laughed at the old tractor, and then it had learned to listen. Money had come and performed its party tricks, and left without applause. The field had kept its secrets and given up enough of them to those who were patient. The man had kept his promise. The machine had kept its word. On the road beyond the barn, a car went by, windows down, radio playing a song that had survived 3 generations. The evening held. The tractor sat quiet and contented, metal cooling with gentle clicks. The sound of a body that had earned its rest. In the story people told and would go on telling, a billionaire laughed at a farmer's old tractor, and the tractor laughed back.